Next, on the topic of ESG integration, a pathway for Thailand's sustainable growth, please welcome Dr. Seree Nonthasoot, member of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights.
Sawasdee krab. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The key message that I would like to deliver today is the role of state, in particular government, in this case, the Thai government agencies, in fostering ESG integration by businesses large and small. The ESG framework is now recognized globally as an important principle and compass for businesses of all sizes to conduct their operation responsibly. Instead of considering the issues of environment, social and governance in separate silos, the ESG framework combines three topics into a composite lens that businesses can utilize to guide and set their policies, direction, and operational indicators. In public perception and expectation, a successful business is one that is profitable financially and sustainable in terms of its ESG dimension. When everyone expects businesses to respect and mainstream ESG, it is a new license to operate for all companies. Despite the importance of ESG, there is still a belief that ESG is an agenda to be pushed and implemented exclusively by businesses. Without a doubt, the ideal scenario is voluntary internalization or integration of ESG by businesses. But there are many roles and initiatives that state must undertake if ESG is to be integrated widely and successfully by businesses. And I will also argue that it is in the interest of state to do so. At the outset, some salient characteristics of the ESG framework must be clarified. Firstly, ESG is an international language, but the priorities of each agenda differ from one country to the next. For example, in Thailand, climate change, natural resource conservation, and plastic waste rank highly on environmental agenda. Child labor and human trafficking on social issue, and anti-corruption and bribery on governance. Secondly, there is clear interconnection and shared objective on global sustainability with other frameworks and principles, particularly the Sustainable Development Goals or the Global Goals, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the UN Global Compact 10 Principles, the OECD Responsible Business Conduct, and others. It should be pointed out immediately that these principles and frameworks, while overlap substantively and procedurally, complement one another, and implementation of one framework often fulfills the mandate of others. Thirdly, ESG framework must be based on robust disclosure and reporting processes and practices, as well as accessible and effective grievance mechanism. Additionally, I would like to point out why ESG integration for and by businesses is a matter of strategic importance for state. In other words, let's start talking about the business case for state's KPI on ESG integration. 3 points come to mind. To begin with, the synergy and nexus between ESG and the global goals that are subscribed by every country from developed to the least developed must be harnessed. We have less than 9 years before the 2030 agenda concludes, and we have to do our utmost to prevent significant regression of the achievement we secured prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. Like state, businesses are duty-bound to implement SDGs, and for state, innovative alliance with businesses to mainstream the SDGs is a ticket for success. I would like to use the case of SDG 12.6 to remind everyone that states must encourage companies to adopt sustainable practices and sustainability reporting. This pertains directly to ESG framework on disclosure and reporting. Secondly, when businesses address ESG issues effectively, it simultaneously helps state to implement its international obligations on human rights, environment, and governance. Thirdly, ESG integration by companies, when executed at scale, enhances the country's image and competitiveness. With these benefits of ESG integration, it is not difficult to see why it is in state interest to proceed more systematically. It is also in our interest to prevent ESG washing by companies that claim to commit to ESG in name, but lacking real commitment and implementation. ESG must not be a mere box-ticking exercise. My presentation will look at 5 key state roles that are linked to ESG integration. I will examine current developments and propose the next policy milestones for each of these roles. The first role is policy maker. As policy maker for ESG integration, state can set direction and expectation, provide incentives that are financial, such as tax measures, and non-financial, such as reward and recognition. The most important aspect of the policy-making role, in my view, is the creation of policy ecosystem that is coherent and dynamic. There are two milestone developments in terms of policy making that should be noted. First, the Ministry of Justice, through its Rights and Liberty Protection Department, deserves recognition for spearheading the preparation and launch of the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, the first such policy document in Asia in 2018, and the introduction of the Human Rights Award for public agencies and business organizations since 2019. The awardees for 2021 are selected from a pool of increasing number of qualified companies that vie for public recognition. ESG integration is among the key award criteria. The other emerging policy development is a collaboration by the Fiscal Policy Office of the Ministry of Finance and other public agencies. In August this year, the working group produced a report called Sustainable Finance Initiative for Thailand, which sets 5 key strategic initiatives to foster ESG integration in financial sector, from developing taxonomy, improving data environment, implementing effective incentives, creating demand-led products and services, and building human capital. As I remarked previously, prioritization of ESG issues can diverge among countries. However, the development of ESG taxonomy that fits the policy environment of any country must be firmly premised on and must not deviate from international obligations and principles. Most importantly, the outcomes set forth in the global goals and various treaties that Thailand is party to. An elephant in the room is ESG integration among government or policy agencies themselves. It will be challenging, to say the least, to ask companies to integrate ESG holistically when they do not see those agencies that demand the action lacking the same initiative. This challenge may stem from the fact that at the moment, policies for each of the ESG topics are devised and developed by different policy agencies, which causes agencies in other silos not to see their relevance to the issue. For example, agencies overseeing climate change policies may not consider the issue of governance as pertinent to the goals of reducing greenhouse gas emission, or agencies on labor policies may lack policy dimension on the issue of environment. If this continues, we will only see fragmentation and not integration of ESG framework. A way out may be to follow the examples of the Sustainable Finance Initiative, where relevant agencies form a working group to focus jointly on ESG policies, as well as creating or appointing a focal agency like the Ministry of Justice in the case of implementing the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. This will help ensure policy coherence and create ownership within government agencies and for business entities. The second role of state on ESG integration is as regulator. Embedment of ESG principle in various regulatory systems is what I would like to call responsible ESG regulatory framework. ESG should become a regulatory component or requirement. Currently, there are a few major regulatory developments, most notably the new requirement by the Securities and Exchange Commission that will be effective next year for companies seeking initial public offerings or IPOs. They will be required to disclose information on the implementation of the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, as well as greenhouse gas emission. A new reporting system that combines financial performance and ESG information will also be introduced. Also in the capital market, the Stock Exchange of Thailand has served as a de facto national ESG knowledge hub. The SET offers ESG products such as Thailand Sustainability Investment and services such as training courses on ESG and reporting. What more should be done in terms of regulation? I have mentioned the concept of responsible ESG regulatory framework, and I would like to expand on it. Two key ESG regulatory measures can be initiated and embedded. The first is ESG licensing or permit requirement. That is to say, companies seeking to obtain licenses will be required to illustrate their ESG compliance, which must also be maintained as part of licensing agreement. The other is ESG contract clause. In the area of public procurement, ESG should serve as a standard qualification criterion of bidders for government contracts. The diagram shown on the screen displays two groups of regulators. The first group represents sector regulators such as Insurance Commission and the Energy Regulatory Commission, and the other represents line agencies, incorporating ESG licensing requirement and ESG contract clause. As regards the SEC and the Stock Exchange of Thailand, the new disclosure requirement under one report system should be buttressed by standard data format and capacity building program for issuers and stakeholders. More importantly, the SET can set a higher threshold for ESG alignment. As of this year, 77 companies are ranked under the Thailand Sustainability Investment from among 760 listed companies. At the minimum, those in the set 100 should all be aligned with ESG or subject to ESG qualification. In the near future, a new SME board will be established to allow SMEs to raise funds more effectively. This tool should serve as a venue for ESG integration. While this state role is not as well known as the first two, state as investor plays a leading role in shaping the industry from within. By deploying ESG as part of investment policy through its sizable portfolio, state automatically sets expectation and decide behavior of companies that attract institutional investment. In this respect, the government pension fund has made headlines in recent years. From initiating an ESG-focused fund in 2018 to launching the ESG collaborative agreement with 32 institutional investors in 2019, which includes the government's Social Security Fund, the GPF, with its 1 trillion baht asset under management, has now fully embedded ESG in its portfolio. The GPF and other state investors, like the Social Security Fund, can further their ESG agenda through a number of initiatives. Joint ESG training programs of their personnel with listed companies, using their leverage to engage collaboratively with invested companies having ESG issues, and align their investment policy with the global goals are among such possible initiatives. The fourth state role is a practical one and directly linked to the livelihood of people. As business operators, state enterprises are expected to lead other businesses by example. From setting the right tone at the top through formulation of ESG policies to performing ESG due diligence and managing relevant risks, the 53 state enterprises and their global and regional value chain wield enormous power in terms of principle, policy, and practices vis-à-vis other companies. There are a few good signs that state enterprises are heading toward the right direction. The State Enterprise Policy Office has introduced in 2020 a new state enterprise assessment model which institutes 8 core enablers. ESG is incorporated in various aspects of these enablers. This year, 5 state enterprises are bestowed the Best in Class Human Rights Award by the Ministry of Justice. More can certainly be done by state enterprises to mainstream and set ESG examples. ESG should be part and parcel of board skill matrix. Annual update program on ESG can be tied to the assessment system. Most importantly, state enterprises must equip themselves with necessary tools to implement and incorporate ESG. For example, due diligence framework, new risk management which examines the ESG risks that can be caused by these enterprises to stakeholders, as well as supply or value chain management. The last role pertains to grievance mechanism. ESG violation must be effectively addressed and remedied. As the global supply chain is inextricably linked and businesses increasingly operate across state borders, remedies are potentially harder to secure, and victims can be left with threats, harassment, and unpaid damages. State as adjudicators, both judicial and non-judicial, must be equipped with greater understanding of business operation and how victims can be assisted to access remedies they deserve. In many countries, companies often use the threat of litigation against victims or their defenders in order to prevent them from making public the violation caused by companies or making claim for damages. Victims are invariably much less powerful than companies. Thus, a more accessible use of class action lawsuit should be provided. With global value chain, the number of cases involving extraterritorial violation will increase. More than ever, state adjudicators must examine and be able to establish the link that can hold companies responsible for violation committed by their subsidiaries or joint ventures abroad, where grievance mechanism is inadequately provided by the host state, which can create an unfortunate loophole for victims and perpetuate impunity for wrongful companies. In conclusion, as ESG is now an expectation for businesses, state must create an environment where this framework can be mainstreamed and maintained continuously. As the policymaker, it needs to create policy requirement for ESG and ensure policy coherence. As the regulator, it can further enhance ESG integration through mobilizing sector regulators, which in turn can initiate regulatory reform to incorporate ESG. As investor, state can adopt ESG in its investment policy that can directly influence businesses to align with new expectations of institutional investors. As the operator, state can set leading examples of how ESG can be integrated in practice. Last but not least, as the adjudicator, state is expected to provide more effective remedies to victims. Thank you for your attention and all the best for companies with ESG commitments. ขอบคุณครับ